It's Wednesday, May 1st, 2013, and this is the Energy Education Podcast. I'm Kevin Hurley. Today, we're taking a closer look at the Canada Deuterium Uranium Reactors. Known as CANDU reactors, these aging machines are lined up along the Canadian side of the Great Lakes. Though they function much differently than American-made reactors, they do share a key vulnerability. We know from Fukushima Daiichi that extraordinary water contamination can result from a nuclear accident. The Japanese meltdown released tremendous amounts of radiation into the Pacific Ocean. Today, we'll discuss what a nuclear accident on one of the Great Lakes might look like. How would a lake, which is much smaller than an ocean, survive a similar radiological release? Joining the discussion today is Dr. Gordon Edwards. Dr. Edwards is the president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. He and Arnie Gundersen are here to help us understand the nuclear situation with our neighbors to the north. Dr. Edwards, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
And of course, Arnie Gundersen, thanks for joining us.
Back again, Kevin. Hi, thanks.
So today we're talking about Canadian nuclear reactors. Why is it important for Americans to know what's going on with these Canadian reactors?
Well, basically the Canadian reactors are sitting on the Great Lakes, and so Great Lakes are a common body of water for both Americans and Canadians. 40 million people draw their drinking water from the Great Lakes. And as we've seen at Fukushima, when you have a major accident, you can have a lot of water, contaminated water, going into the nearby body of water. And in our case, that would be the Great Lakes.
So, Gordon, then what are the differences between the American and the Canadian reactors?
Well, fundamentally, all reactors are the same in the sense that they produce energy. While producing energy, they produce radioactive waste materials which generate heat even after the reactor shut down. And that's why even for years after shutdown, you still have a problem of heat being generated that has to be cooled. That heat has to be removed or you're going to have problems. So the Canadian reactors are, in that sense, pose the same problems as the American reactors. There is a difference, however. And that is that in the Canadian case, when we have what's called a loss of coolant accident, that means like a pipe break, for example, which would allow the cooling water to escape. In the American case, when you lose the coolant, the power goes down right away. In the Canadian case, as soon as you lose the coolant, the power goes up. So we have a particularly touchy reactor system in that regard.
Yeah, that has a fancy technical name. It's called a positive void reactivity coefficient. And basically, it's like a car. You know, when you go to hit the brakes, the accelerator goes down to the floor, which is not the way we're used to driving. You know, it's interesting because these, back in the 50s, there was a lot of different reactor designs. The Canadians had no enrichment capability. They didn't build a bomb, so they didn't have enrichment capability. So they came up with a design that didn't need enriched uranium, and they called it CANDU, C-A-N-D-U. And it runs on normal uranium. But in order to run on normal uranium, it needed to run on what we call heavy water, which is a hydrogen atom with 2 neutrons called deuterium. That then forced them to continuously refuel because there was a teeny bit of uranium that was fissile in the fuel. So the Canadian reactors have the fuel going in sideways, and the American reactors have it going in from top to bottom. The Canadian reactors always refuel, not because they wanted to, but because they had to, because the low enrichment, they were burning out the little bit of uranium that was available. Now, the Indians thought that was great because it's a great way of making plutonium. And the first Indian bombs were actually created from a CANDU reactor.
What you're saying is they're using a low-grade uranium as opposed to an enriched uranium. They're using something more natural.
Yeah, in a natural uranium has 7 parts of fissile uranium, uranium-235, for every 1,000 parts of uranium. Whereas the American reactors run on about 50 parts of uranium to 1,000. That allows the American reactors to run for a lot longer before refueling. But in the Canadian reactors, they burn out those 7 atoms pretty quickly, so they have to continuously pull the fuel and put new fuel in. That creates a piping maze. There's an enormous amount of pipes on the side of their reactors that are called pressure tubes, and those are aging. Fairewinds just finished a report for Durham Nuclear Awareness that talks about the problems of allowing the Pickering unit, which is about 3 hours outside of Buffalo, New York, allowing the Pickering unit to continue to operate. It's already 40 years old. It's got 6 nuclear reactors that are operating and 2 that are shut down, one of the biggest nuclear reactor complexes in the world. And the Canadians don't want to fix it. They want to pencil whip the calculations and squeeze more time out of a design whose time has come.
If I could just clarify, like in the American case, what you have is one big pot, which is called the reactor vessel, where all the fuel is and where all the cooling is and where the reaction takes place. In Canada, we have a core. The core area of the reactor is subdivided into hundreds of individual horizontal tubes, and the fuel is in these horizontal tubes. So it's more complicated. That's what Arnie is saying. And being more complicated, it means that one of the things that most people don't understand is that the radiation, the radioactivity in the core of the reactor is so intense that it's deadly to go anywhere close to it. And the result is it's very difficult to maintain pipes which are degrading because of the high pressure, because of the high temperature, and most of all because of the bombardment with neutrons. It's called neutron embrittlement that takes place over time. So what happens over time is that these pipes get weakened and they change their chemistry, they change their physical properties, and it's so radioactive in there that you really can't go and check all those pipes. You can only check a few of them. And that's the fundamental problem, is that we no longer know just exactly how degraded some of these pipes might be. And that's why it becomes problematic when they want to run the plant longer than it was intended to be run, because we don't know if those pipes are on the bursting point or not.
You know, most Canadians live within 200 miles of the border with the United States. And what the Canadians did then is to build their reactors on the border with the United States. You know, here in Burlington, Vermont, the closest nuclear reactor is a Canadian reactor up in Quebec that just was shut down permanently. But it's interesting when for us on the northern side of the United States, the nearest reactor might very well be in Canada, and its design is unlike anything in the world. There's only about 6% of the reactors in the world are this Canadian design, the CANDU reactor.
Now, the nice thing is that here in Quebec, we managed to get that reactor shut down permanently. The government decided not to invest billions of dollars in refurbishing the reactor. Now, refurbishing is a fancy word, but what it really means is replacing all those old pipes with brand new ones. So they would take out those hundreds and hundreds of tubes that go through the core of the reactor, as well as the hundreds of tubes that are connected to the ends of those so-called pressure tubes, and they replace them with brand new ones. So then at least they know that they're not at the breaking point. What's happening in Toronto, what's happening just outside of Toronto at Pickering on Lake Ontario, is that they want to, that is Ontario Power Generation, they want to push the envelope by running these plants for an extra 5 years without replacing those tubes. So they have decided not to make the expense of replacing all those tubes with new ones, and yet they still want permission to run it for an extra 5 years. And that's really what the controversy is.
So the same country's got two standards. The province of Quebec says shut this down, and whereas in Ontario they're trying to squeeze more life out of an aging reactor.
Yeah, and that's partly because Ontario has become so dependent upon nuclear electricity. They built so many nuclear reactors. They've got 8 just outside Toronto at Pickering. They've got another 8 up on Lake Huron called Bruce. And then they've got 4 more at a place called Darlington, which is also on Lake Ontario. So Ontario has become very dependent on nuclear power, and that's why they don't see an easy energy alternative. They want to extend the lifetime of these 4 reactors in order to be able to refurbish 4 other reactors, the Darlington reactors. And, it sounds like a simple matter to replace the pipes in something. You think, well, that sounds like a pretty simple job. You just pull out the old pipes and put in the new ones. The problem is they're all highly radioactive. In fact, they're all going to become permanently radioactive waste. They can't be recycled, even though this stuff is some of the best material in the world, some of the finest material. It's going to have to be treated as radioactive waste. So that's what makes it so difficult. And when they try to do it, they find out it takes a lot longer than they expected, and it also costs a lot more money than they expected. But it definitely costs somewhere between $2 and $4 billion just to replace those tubes.
So we've talked a lot in the past about the deteriorating condition of these older reactors. With Fukushima happening on the Pacific Ocean, and now today, we're talking about these Canadian reactors that are sitting, many of them, on Great Lakes, and perhaps many of them getting up there in age. Is there really a lesson from Fukushima that applies to nuclear reactors sitting on the Great Lakes? And what would the difference be in the case of some kind of similar problem?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good question. And I raised this during a hearing of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. I said, look, if we had a similar accident here in Canada, for example, where would all that contaminated water go? We know where it went in Fukushima. It went right into the Pacific Ocean initially, and then they built huge tanks, 7 huge tanks, to contain the contaminated water, which is an ongoing problem even 2 years later. They're still getting more and more contaminated water every day. And they're running out of space to store it all. They're even going to cut down a forest to make room to make more tanks to hold the contaminated water. Now those tanks are leaking. So we have to ask ourselves, if there was a nuclear accident of that sort in Canada or in the States, where would all that contaminated water go? The answer seems obvious. It would go into the Great Lakes, and that's the drinking water for 40 million people. So, we certainly had better be prepared.
I've been talking to scientists over at Woods Hole, and Woods Hole is acknowledging that, Fukushima Daiichi's leak is big enough that it's contaminating the Pacific Ocean. And the Pacific Ocean is a lot bigger than the Great Lakes, even though the Great Lakes are pretty great. So, the same level of contamination from Fukushima Daiichi into the Pacific, had it occurred on the Great Lakes, would pose serious health effects for the 40 million people that use that water. But we don't take that into account in our accident analyses. We don't believe that what's happening at Fukushima is a lesson that we have to take around the world.
And of course, if something like that did happen in the Great Lakes, it's not something that's easily cleaned up in the next few years or the next decade.
No, it definitely accumulates. Even under normal operation, the Canadian reactors are contributing a great deal of radioactive pollution to the Great Lakes in the form of a radioactive isotope of hydrogen called tritium. This is simply radioactive hydrogen, and, water is made up of H2O, it's hydrogen and oxygen. Well, when you get tritium released from a Canadian reactor, it forms water molecules which are themselves radioactive. And these radioactive water molecules, they go everywhere. Water is one of the basic materials for all living things. So it goes into every living object, every living being. So it enters the food chain quite readily. And in Lake Ontario, already the levels of tritium, even in the middle of the lake, are about 3 times greater than they are in Lake Superior. And that's entirely because of nuclear power, and in particular because of the Canadian reactors. We produce about 30 times as much tritium for each unit of energy produced due to the fact that we use heavy water, which is the first step towards radioactive tritium. But that's small potatoes compared with a huge nuclear accident, because, again, most people have no understanding of the intensity of the radioactivity created in the core of the reactor during normal operation. You see, the uranium that goes in is not nearly as radioactive as the stuff that comes out. The stuff that comes out is millions of times more radioactive than what goes in, and the reason for that is because the uranium atoms are split. And it's all those broken pieces of uranium atoms which are so intensely radioactive. When you hear words like cesium-137 and so on, those are little broken pieces of uranium atoms. And that's the stuff that's going into the ocean at Fukushima, and that's the stuff that would happen here in Canada or in the States.
Well, I'm sure, though, you would prevent the radiation from crossing over the international boundary, and it would stay on your side of the line.
Oh, yeah, we'd have put up signs saying no radiation here.